All right. Thanks for coming. Is everybody enjoying SAINTCON? I think this is probably my favorite SAINTCON. I've only been to 4 of them, but I think this has been my favorite. Presentation I'm going to be giving today is on how to complete a vendor review the right way. And by the right way, I mean I have no idea, but it's not really true. I don't think there really is a right way to complete a vendor security review, but the stuff I'm going to talk about today, I hope, is good information to help relieve some of the stress that we have in either administering or receiving security questionnaires. So I'll be sharing some of my experiences, some of the stuff that we do at Lucid Software. So, as I said, my name is Chase Palmer. My handle is Raider6672. That comes from the age of America Online when they were distributing little floppy disks, and you got about 30 minutes of free internet. And that was the username I used for the chat rooms. So then I've just been too lazy to change it. So Raider6672. My background is mainly in PCI. I worked in PCI for about 10 years. I spent a brief stint working for the government, for the Defense Information Systems Agency, before I found myself at Lucid Software working as a security engineer. One of the big things I work on is our compliance and a lot of our governance. And I am a CISSP, and I did one crazy thing in my life, and I started a nonprofit. So I'm the president of a nonprofit organization, and if anybody wants to come and talk to me afterwards about my adventures in running a nonprofit, you're welcome to do that. Just a clarification, just because I'm a CISSP doesn't mean I'm a hacker, so if I provide any information here that leads you to believe that, it's not true. I do not hack into things. So, why do we perform security vendor reviews? Trusting someone with our data is, it can be a scary thing, especially when you're dealing with your customers' data. So when you're looking at potential vendors to help you out with your work, whether it's looking at some open source software or off-the-shelf software, there are certain considerations that need to be taken before you plug that into your infrastructure, into your network, or before you even start giving them data. I do get the great experience of working on both sides of vendor reviews. I help administer those reviews, and then I also answer questionnaires that come from our customers. So I think I've got a bit of a unique experience there. Now, having done this for a little while now, I do feel like companies are performing security reviews in the wrong way. And I just want to share some of my pain points and ways that things that I've experienced that have tried to help simplify this a bit. So why do we need to perform security reviews? There's 2 main reasons why we need to perform security reviews. The first one is compliance. If you've spent any time in the security field, you will hear words such as GDPR, CCPA, PCI, but then you also have obligations that are under your customers' contracts to perform these security reviews. The other one is just overall security. You need to know what your vendors are going to do with the data that you have, and you don't want to be introducing any weak links into your, or major weak links into your information security. So 100%, what does that mean? Well, it's 100% is how often it is wrong to make an assumption about a vendor. You will oftentimes see vendors that will put logos on their website to say, hey, we work with such and such company, you can trust us. Well, I say question everything. You never know if they've just swiped a logo off the internet or they're just trying to make themselves look better than they really are. So before we get started, before you get started in vendor reviews, there's a few things that you need to get in order for you to be able to successfully perform those vendor reviews or to answer them yourself. First thing is to keep and take and keep inventory of the data or the information that you're collecting from your customers, your visitors, your website visitors, your clients. Not only do people want to know what data you're collecting from them and for what purpose you're collecting it, but you really can't protect something you don't know it doesn't even exist and needs protection. So keeping inventory of that data is really important. Some of the examples of data that you may be collecting and some of the general groupings of that data are PII, PCI information, and employee information. Unless you're working in the healthcare industry, you may not have to worry about healthcare information, but you may inadvertently find yourself in that area. So just keep that in mind. So this isn't an exhaustive list, so you're just going to you'll have to dig deep into find out what information that you are gathering and how that information ties with any laws and regulations that you may be beholden to. The next thing you need to do is to classify that data. Not all the data that you collect is going to be super sensitive, confidential information, but a lot of it is going to be. You also need to make sure that if you have any contractual obligations to protect the data, that you are aware of that. And then make sure you know who has access to that data and whether or not they have access to view it, modify it, delete it, etc. So there's a few different ways to classify your data, and there's no real right way to do it. You can basically say all data is confidential and we're going to treat all data as confidential, or you can break it out. One of the most common or well-known classifications is the Defense or the Department of Defense's unclassified, secret, and top secret. You could do that if you wanted to feel cool. But what you choose to do is up to you. At Lucid, we use public, sensitive, confidential, and restricted to classify our data. So there are several different kinds of regulations that you may run into, and you need to be aware of these because they can have major impacts on how you run your security programs and what kind of data you can or cannot collect or you should be collecting. But also certain kinds of disclosures that you need to be providing to your customers if you are collecting data. Big ones, GDPR, PCI, CCPA, and then if you're dealing with any of the anything in the education industry, you're going to have COPPA and FERPA. So just keep those in mind. There's a lot more out there. I'd also recommend keeping a repository or somewhere where you have a list of the different regulations that you have to, or laws and regulations that you have to abide by, links to the actual text of those regulations, and keep notes of the major provisions that you need to be following, because it will come up in audits that you are aware of those things, and that's a good way to prove that you are staying aware of them. Then you need to keep in mind or determine the risks that are involved with keeping that data. So your risk appetite is defined as the level of risk that an organization is prepared to accept in pursuit of its objectives before action is deemed necessary to reduce the risk. And that's going to be different for each company. So you're going to need to figure that out for your business, for your company, and then just keep that in mind as you're collecting information. So as a side note, if you're not currently conducting regular security risk assessments of your company, it's not something that I'm going to cover in this presentation, but it is a very important part of your overall security awareness of your security posture. So if you're interested, I have written a blog post all about security reviews. You're welcome to go check that out. I'll hold that there if anybody wants to take a picture of it. See people pulling out their phones, so hold on just 1 minute. It's a long read, I'm sorry. I kind of got carried away with it. It's probably the longest blog post on our tech blog, so you might want to grab a cup of coffee. All right, so who do you have performing these reviews? Again, this is going to be different for everybody. To begin with, it may be a designated security person. Dedicated security people are going to be quite familiar with your business security practices, procedures, and policies, and they're going to generally have a good background in security. And so it's a pretty logical choice to have this kind of person handling security views. But security people can tend to be fairly expensive. Lucid currently works in a kind of a split capacity. Where we have all customer-facing questionnaires are handled by a solution engineering team, and all vendor questionnaires are administered and reviewed by the security team. And this has worked quite well for us over the last several years, but it's something that we've talked about reevaluating as we've started to grow. So as I said, we do have a solutions engineer team that's currently working on our customer-facing stuff, so when does it make sense to have a pre-sales person completing the questionnaire? I don't know. That's all honesty. I don't know. It's going to be different, but as a general concept, when a business starts to grow and the sales pipeline is flowing, a dedicated security person could possibly end up being a bottleneck to the sales flow. So having a cross-trained individual or team that can fill these customer questionnaires in line with the salespeople can help close the deals faster. However, since the people would be sitting in with under the sales business unit and security isn't their primary focus, these individuals may not have all of the answers or may not have the answers as quickly as a trained security professional. So these people will need to have different tools to help them answer the questions that they may not be able to answer right away. And if that fails, they really need to have open communication with the security team who's going to have those answers. One of the downsides that I've perceived from this is sometimes incorrect answers are provided to the customer, which may end up triggering a deeper investigation by the customer, and then it results in the security team having to retcon the previous answer. And that can be a little bit embarrassing sometimes, and they may actually question whether or not we have our ducks in a row. One of the tools, probably one of the best tools that I've seen is just basically having some pre-filled questionnaires. You're going to have a bunch of pre-filled standard questionnaires that you can fill out. I'm drawing a blank at the moment. I shouldn't, but we'll cover some of these questionnaires later on. But having the questionnaires pre-filled out, if they're pretty standard, and if you get a request of completed questionnaire, it's as easy as turning around and supplying the pre-filled questionnaire back. The other tools that can be really useful in this case are also having a SOC 2 report or any certifications like ISO certifications. Those can in a lot of cases, eliminate the need to actually complete the questionnaire because you're providing all the data to the customer. It can be really hard to keep track of all the information. I didn't realize this before I started working at Lucid Software, but there is a lot of information, or a lot of stuff that you have to keep in mind when it comes to how your security is working, the different aspects of your infrastructure, and so it can be really hard to keep that stuff all in your head. I know people that can do it, I can't. So having a knowledge base is really a good tool to have to be able to reference to get those answers that you may, to questions that you may not get all too often, and you may forget those answers. But also if you're bringing on any new team members to your security team or to your risk team or anything like that, it can help flatten out that learning curve because they have all that information right at their fingertips. But keeping a knowledge base, you have to keep it up to date, otherwise things will get messy. And if you don't upkeep it, it can be painful to go back and clean it up, as I have recently figured out firsthand as we've been going through our knowledge base. It has grown a lot bigger than I had expected, and it's a lot of stuff to review. So right now I want to focus on there's two sides of vendor reviews. You're either on the giving end or the receiving end. I'm going to first talk about the giving end of things, or administering those questionnaires. So anyone that has gone through answering a security questionnaire can relate to this. I love answering security questionnaires. Said no one ever. There are better things we could be doing than spending our time answering questionnaires. Last year at SAINTCON, I had to step away for about 8 hours to help complete a 300 plus question questionnaire. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit, but I'd rather much be practicing some red team, blue team stuff, soldering mini badges, and listening to all of the other great talks, rather than sitting in a corner on the phone going over a bunch of questions. So if you're administering these questionnaires, just keep in mind the poor souls that are on the other end of your beating stick. So this means that you need to be a bit more selective, or I would recommend being a little more selective about your questions that you're giving to your vendors. It can be a difficult process, but it's going to be crucial to getting a clear enough picture of the security practices, of the vendor's security practices, so you can make an educated decision on whether or not they're going to properly secure your information. If you select too few questions, you're not going to know anything about the vendor, and you'll just end up having to ask more questions later on. And if you ask too many questions, then you'll get a lot of extra stuff that you're going to have to weed through. It's going to create a lot of noise, and again, you're ultimately going to not get a very clear picture. So there is going to be a bit of a balance there. So knowing what data we need to protect, what laws and regulations you need to abide by, and what kinds of risks you are willing to accept play heavily into what kinds of questions you will need to ask. A good place to start is to look at these standard questionnaires if you don't know what kinds of questions to ask. These questionnaires are kind of a one-size-fits-all, and they're kind of a shotgun approach. They don't... Did I lose the screen? Back. Okay. Somebody's playing some games. These questionnaires don't take into consideration things we talked about, such as your what kind of data you're collecting, or what kind of data they will be collecting, your risk appetite and such. But a lot of companies, like I said, have these questionnaires pre-filled out, and you can get a pretty quick turnaround on them. Those questionnaires are the standard ones the big ones that I've seen are the CIS Top 20, the CAKE, the NIST 800, SIG, or more commonly the SIG Lite, and the VSAQ. We do have these filled out so that we can quickly turn these around if we need to. They're not our most favorite thing to do because they are quite lengthy, and as like I said, they're kind of a shotgun approach, and so there's a lot of NAs that we put on these questionnaires. And anytime we put a non-applicable, we have to explain why it's not applicable, which is just as annoying. So what we do is at Lucid, we actually create a custom questionnaire. It's something that I personally would recommend doing. It takes a little more time to get up and running, but I feel that it will provide with the better responses and addressing the specific concerns that your company may be facing or may need to look at. There are platforms out there that will do this automatically for you, but they'll they'll weed out some of the questionnaires. They'll automatically, or they won't present to you, as a reviewer, they won't present to you questions that you may have deemed as low risk. But what that really means is that you're just asking a bunch of checkbox questions, and they really don't provide much value to you. If everybody's answering yes to them, why ask them? They're probably pretty standard stuff. That also happens generally if you're asking yes or no questions. So I wouldn't recommend using yes or no questions because you're not going to get really the details that you're going to be looking for. So you just need to be clear and direct. Don't go overboard and ask for more details than are necessary. I just ran into this morning. It seems like every time I come to SAINTCON, I get bombarded with these questionnaires. Somebody must think that it's a good time for me to answer questionnaires. But they were asking for evidence for every single question that we had, and some of the stuff I just was shaking my head because I'm not going to provide you with the configuration files for our firewalls and other IT equipment, so stop asking. So don't go into minute details about firewall rules. You can ask what softwares you use, but in general, it's better to ask whether or not they have policies in place to be able to review those that software regularly. We've had questionnaires come in where they've wanted to know every piece of software and every version. I just don't think they're going to be going through and checking out every single version of every piece of software that we use. So again, it's just probably not going to lead you to any valuable data. Let's see. So some of the specifics that I like to look for when performing a security review is what kinds of integrations, or things that I should say, that I try to take into consideration is what kind of integrations are we talking about. Common ones are Salesforce. We get a lot of requests for plugins to add to Salesforce, things like Marketo, Drupal, WordPress. And those are a lot of things that may fly under the radar as well. It's really easy to install a WordPress plugin, but there are also a lot of really bad WordPress plugins. How is the data being transferred and who has access to it? Want to focus on those kinds of things. What kind of training will they be doing? Everybody should be doing security awareness training. It's part of PCI. It's part of most contracts. But we want to make sure that if we're going to give somebody data, that their people, whoever has access to that data, is going to be, they know what they're doing and they can be entrusted with that data. This is probably my biggest beef with a lot of security questionnaires. I can't tell you how many times I received a questionnaire that are geared towards platforms or infrastructures as a platform, like AWS or Google Cloud, Azure, and we're a SaaS provider. And that 300-question questionnaire I was talking about earlier, about a third of that questionnaire was related to how we were going to protect their virtual machines and what kinds of protections were in place to protect their applications that they would be hosting on there. And none of that really applied, and we spent a good couple hours going through those and marking those as not applicable. And we still had to read through them to make sure we weren't missing anything, but it was just super annoying. So Lucid's primary service is to drag and drop shapes onto a canvas to visually process and correlate data. So in other words, we're creating flowcharts. It does more than that, but we're not putting virtual machines. We're not allowing customers to spin up virtual machines on our services. So it should be fairly obvious when you're evaluating a product such as Lucidchart on what capabilities it has, and so you should be able to tailor your questionnaires for that. Now, it doesn't mean you have to create a custom questionnaire for each vendor. That can be really time-consuming, and it would frankly be a nightmare. But Lucid has broken up the focus and intent of our questionnaires to several different categories, and we'll get that, and these are the categories, and I'll show a little bit of a diagram a little bit later about the process diagram, how we go through that. So we've come up with our questionnaire is 34 questions. Now we may cut a few questions out based off the risk level that we've deemed the vendor, whether or not they're collecting PII or if it's other certain data. So, and we may ask a few additional questions, vendor-specific questions. So we've taken a look at the product and we feel that there's a few additional questions that we need to ask. This generally comes up with using external Java libraries, JavaScript libraries, and we'll want to ask different questions about how maybe those libraries are updated and what kind of calls they're making and to what servers are being accessed. So those are just some examples of the questions that we're asking. We try to be fairly direct. We don't want really long-winded answers because every time somebody provides a long-winded answer, we have to read that long-winded answer. But we don't ask yes or no questions. Generally, we don't ask yes or no questions. If we do ask a yes or no question, we will ask a follow-up question for a little bit more detail. Along with administering or giving an actual questionnaire, it's actually really good to actually collect some documentation. People can lie on questionnaires. They can fudge the truth just a little bit. But gathering some of these documents and performing your security reviews can help provide certain levels of evidence that those policies are in place, that they are looking at and addressing those particular items. Now everybody should have a privacy policy on their website. If you have visitors coming to your website, you are collecting data, so you should have a privacy policy. SOC 2 report is really awesome to have. It's really painful sometimes to get, but in the end, it's a great tool to have. Collecting those SOC reports is also a great way for you to get the details that you may not be able to get in a questionnaire. Pen test results. I don't recommend going out and asking for full pen test results, because if somebody's going to give you their full pen test results, they're just giving you a list of their vulnerabilities, and that may not be a very good security practice. So generally ask for summaries of the pen tests, numbers of categories, numbers of vulnerabilities in different categories, high, low, medium, and whether or not they've addressed those. So this is a little bit of Lucid's decision tree that we use to determine what kinds of questionnaires that we're going to be providing. We're not going to provide necessarily the same questionnaire to a vendor who's providing a Salesforce plugin versus somebody who's going to be a full-on SaaS provider. So I don't necessarily want you to internalize. This is a specific thing to us, but just want to give you an idea of the decisions that we're making as we're going through this. So the big question is platform or no platform? I kind of harped on the platform a little bit earlier, but platforms are not bad. There are some pros and cons to using platforms. It makes it really easy for you to follow up with vendors. We find that that's a real big thing that eats up our time, is trying to constantly go through our list of vendors, determine when the last time was that we performed a review, and reaching out to them, and all sorts of things. You can also generally get your sales team involved. A lot of times these platforms will have an intake process to be able to get vendors into the pipeline. And you have a lot of automation, like I had mentioned earlier. Some of the cons, I've seen some really terrible platforms where every time you clicked on something, the whole page had to refresh, and it took ages to answer any sort of question. So it can end up in end user frustration, which then can end in, or can result in longer times for the vendor to provide responses back. They can be expensive, and they can tend to be pretty inflexible. We've seen some really flexible ones out there, but some of them are pretty locked down and won't allow you to do custom questionnaires. They stick to some of those general ones that we mentioned earlier. If you are considering a vendor platform, just a kind of a rule of thumb here, the platforms are good for companies that are managing several hundreds of vendors on an annual basis. But for companies who are just handling a handful of vendors, it's probably going to be overkill. A spreadsheet would probably do well. I know that there are a lot of industries out there that are pretty locked down, and you may only have 2, 3, 4, 5 vendors. But I've heard of companies that have 1,000+ vendors, and that would be, working off a spreadsheet would not be ideal in that case. Now, all of this is, after I've said all this, you may need to be prepared to do this on your own. Sometimes vendors just refuse to complete the questionnaires. And so you can either put a hard stop on it and walk away, or you can prepare to do some digging and find the answers on your own. And this happens a lot with self-service vendors, where you're not actually engaging with a salesperson, you're just going to their website and you're signing up for a service. Or you're just a small fry in the pool, and you're not providing very much revenue to that vendor. They don't want to spend the time or the money answering your questionnaire, because they'll end up in a net loss on the deal. So, switching gears, we're going to move over to the receiving end and answering these questionnaires. If you're handling data from your customers, there's a good chance that you're going to be asked to fill out these questionnaires. And it may seem pretty straightforward, but they can get a little complicated. So I do have some tips to help answering these questions. Number one is focus on the scope of the service. As I discussed earlier, you can get questionnaires that go way beyond the scope of what you're going to be providing to the customer. And in the end, the customer is really going to be concerned about a number of things. They're going to be concerned about how do they get their data to you in a secure way. When you have their data, what are you going to do to store it and protect it? Who's going to have access to that data, and where are they going to be accessing that data? And do the people who have access to that data know what they're doing and how to protect it? And if something goes horribly wrong, who can they contact? So try to avoid providing responses to try to keep it in scope. Try not to provide responses that move into areas where you're not going to be accessing data. So for example, Lucidchart is completely hosted within AWS in a virtual private cloud. It's completely segmented from our corporate network. So for the most part, we consider our corporate network out of scope. Now, there are a few things that we have to still consider, because we do have some remote access into that environment. But when we respond, we primarily focus on our AWS infrastructure. It can be really tempting when you get into these questionnaires to try and reinvent the wheel. So it's a lot easier to refer a customer to a section within an information security policy, which can usually provide the exact information this customer is looking for without you having to rewrite it. Now, don't be a jerk and say, look in our information security policy, but rather say something like, refer to section 4 of our business continuity policy. And this will save you time from having to write out long explanations that are already well documented, and the customer is going to get actually better evidence that the particular item's being addressed. Now this is a real easy trap to fall into. It can be tempting to provide too much data and too much details and you may end up providing sensitive information that you probably shouldn't be providing to anybody. For example, avoid providing exact names to people who are in charge of certain things. Don't provide configuration details about networks, routers, and firewalls. So ask yourself, can this information be used by an attacker to gain access to my network? Does it provide information that somebody could use for a phishing or a vishing attack? If yes, don't provide it. Security professionals should understand that. Lucid will provide executive summaries of our scan results and pen test results, but we don't provide customers with the details about them. We'll give them the number of vulnerabilities found, the criticality of those findings, and whether or not they've been fixed. You wouldn't want to provide a customer, or you wouldn't want to provide a potential attacker that you have an SQL injection vulnerability that was found on the page and that you're still working on fixing it. If that information got into the wrong hands, you'd be having a very bad day. Be clear in your responses, but remember this isn't a marketing campaign. Putting too much fluff on your responses can actually backfire. It makes it sound like you're trying to cover things up. So keep it simple and straight to the point. And so none of this best of market, state of the art, we're better than our competitors stuff. It'll just create doubt. So let the salespeople do the selling. So here's a couple examples of, and these are, I've made these up, but I have seen examples of these, and they're based off of examples that I've seen. So on the left, you have the company has implemented a state-of-the-art interactive security and compliance program to ensure the necessary levels of understanding and knowledge of blah, 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 blah. I just shut off. Where a good response would be all employees go through a security awareness training upon hire and annually thereafter, and software developers go through regular secure coding training. Other security-related trainings are made available to employees on an ad hoc basis through our learning management system. It's a much clearer, direct response. They're getting the data that they need. They're not having to weed through a bunch of marketing fluff. If you're collecting data about your customers, you're going to need, probably legally required, to have a privacy policy published on your website, as I mentioned earlier. But having good information in your privacy policy about how you're protecting the data you collect, and having a security white paper or two that's publicly available can help reduce the amount of questionnaires that you may be asked to complete. It's also a very common practice to limit who can request that a questionnaire be filled out. You'll often see this limited to enterprise customers, those who have custom contracts, or those who generate a minimum amount of revenue on an annual basis. So that can also reduce the number of questionnaires that you may be asked to complete, but you need to be careful with the approach. If you set your thresholds too high, then your sales teams may be struggling to close deals. But providing this documentation online for the smaller customers can help them get the answers that they may need. And I'd be lying if our legal team didn't tell me to put this in here, but it's important to have non-disclosures. You are going to be providing certain levels of sensitivity, data with certain levels of sensitivity to these customers, and so you want to make sure that you're protected legally. So make sure that before you provide SOC 2 reports, pen test results, executive summaries of those pen test results, or any other details about your information security policies, make sure you have a non-disclosure in place. This will protect you legally if a customer misuses any of the information that you provide to them, such as providing it to a customer, or to a competitor, I should say. So now that you've got all these vendors and you've completed reviews on them, You need to keep track of them, and that comes down to vendor management. What are you going to do to, or what are the different things that you need to do to keep track of these vendors? Number one is when to reevaluate. Highly regulated industries like financial or educational institutions may have this dictated for them. I've never worked directly with in these industries, so I don't know exactly what those regulations are, but I know that they are highly regulated. So this may not apply. But as a rule of thumb, at minimum, if your customer interacts with the product, either directly or indirectly, the application or the service, if the application or the service will have access to your network or you are sharing data with the vendor, you will want to conduct a security review. Your risk appetite, legal obligations, they may have a say in this as well. You may choose to conduct full reviews on all vendors every time, or you may be a little more selective you may be more selective based on the sensitivity of the data, and you're going to provide partial reviews to lower risk, lower sensitive vendors, and leave the full reviews to the rest. So you'll just need to figure out what works best for your organization. Reevaluating, in most cases, in a lot of cases, it's not necessary to review them every single year, but there are some vendors that you will probably need to review on an annual basis. Things that we have done as far as reevaluating vendors, we'll provide conditional approvals on some vendors, and those approvals will last 3 to 6 months. And at that time, we'll need to conduct another review. This will generally occur if we find that something is missing in their security, but they're a low-risk vendor, and they've indicated that fixing it is on their immediate roadmap. Annual reviews are conducted on mission-critical services and high-risk vendors. So they have a lot of access to a lot of sensitive data. Moderate risk vendors are evaluated every other year, and low risk vendors are conducted on an ad hoc basis. There are, of course, exceptions to these rules, such as if we discover that a vendor has made a significant change to their product, they've been bought out or merged with another company, or been suspected of a data breach, in which case we will perform a security review sooner than what they may have been originally scheduled for. Keeping a record of your approvals is really important for audits and also for historical purposes to make sure that somebody doesn't start using an application and say that you did approve it and you can't prove that you did or not. So keep track of them. So what should you keep track of? You'll want to keep track of who performed the assessment, who gave the approval, the date of the approval, and any notes of any risk or any special conditions with that approval. You may have other laws and regulations, again, that are going to have a factor here. How long you store them, might be 3 years, might be 7 years. But if you don't have anybody telling you how long you have to keep them, you'll want to at least keep them around for at least until a new review has been conducted. So you have a continual, you always have a fresh review on hand. And then keeping track of where your data is and what purpose it's there for. This is called data mapping. And anybody who's involved in GDPR knows what data mapping is. It makes it 1,000 times easier when it comes to knowing where your data is if you are on top of your data mapping and keeping track of anytime you bring on a new vendor, keeping a log of what data they have access to and where that data is going to be stored, whether that's in the United States or it's going to be in another country. So just do it. Vendor reviews can be hard, but in the end, it's worth it. You'll be a lot safer, and you'll have a lot more confidence in the products or the vendors that you're going to be using. It's also going to help your customers, and it's going to boost their confidence in you. So it is definitely worth it in the end. And with that brings me to the end. Are there any questions out there about what we've discussed? No questions? Yes. I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question. I heard something about the standard questionnaires and how we that's a good question. So the question is how did we decide what questions to pull from these standard questionnaires? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Yeah. So it really came down to a lot of the areas of focus that we're looking at. We're really concerned about where that data is living because of GDPR reasons. We want to know what kind of data they have access to, and so questions about their storage methods, their access control, and things like that are we're going to be pulling in. A lot of the questions we've actually we've free-handed written them. We didn't actually pull them from the questions, but we've used them as inspiration. I don't know if that was a very good answer to your question, but it's a complicated thing. Are there any other questions? Back.
So what do you say or do to push back when a vendor or potential partner asks for too much information?
We'll generally just say that it's against our security policy to provide that information. We generally don't get much pushback when it comes to that, but we've had pretty good success with it. We just don't provide that information. Right here. Uh-huh. Yeah, so the question is how do we balance when a question, or we find out that a vendor isn't up to snuff, but the people requesting the software deems it as a critical part of the business flow. That happens. It happens a lot. And you get a lot of conflicts between the risk team or the security team. Lucid, we've at least set ourselves as we'll provide the evidence and our advice on it, but we're not necessarily the last stop of authority for it. If there is a disagreement, we will run it up the chain to our executive management where it will be reviewed, and that's when we apply our risk appetite. We determine what kinds of risks are involved and whether or not that's something that we're willing to take on with this vendor. Anything else? Great questions. All right, if there's no other questions, thank you for attending. I hope you found something interesting out of it. And feel free to come and talk to me afterwards.